Okay, so this presentation is just to finish up what we had talked about in terms of citations. So what we're going to be doing is it's not necessarily talking about citations, but when would be an appropriate time to cite. So remember, this is all the material that we had discussed in class, the plagiarism, don't do that. The only thing that I want to do here is I simply want to emphasize the fact that you are citing both word for word quotes as well as paraphrase and summary. So even if you're not using word for word, even if you are simply summarizing what perhaps Joanne Orlando had said in source 2, you still have to make sure that you cite that. So we talked about parenthetical citation, what goes in the parentheses, how to do the different types of, or the different number of authors, etc., blah, blah, blah. In-text citations, when do you use citation, the either citation, and remember, you decide. You have to decide when would be the best time and place to use in-text versus parenthetical citation. I will remind you that the rubric does say that you should be using a diversity of different citations, and so you should be using both parenthetical and in-text throughout your paper. That doesn't mean that you use in the same sentence in-text and parenthetical. What that means is throughout the paper, you should be using sometimes parenthetical, sometimes in-text. But then we talked a little bit more about how to quote material that was in an article itself. So you're not quoting the article, you are quoting the material that is cited in the article. So that's how you do that. We discussed that in class. And then how do you cite multiple sources in the same sentence? Remember, I'd encourage you to do a parenthetical citation. That's what we had discussed in class. That would be my suggestion because then it can get a little tricky. Now, this is what my focus is for this video. Can you ever cite too much? So in essence, the rule of thumb is if you have to ask yourself, whoops, I don't know why that's happening. If you have to ask yourself, should I cite? You should probably cite it, okay? And so typically no one's ever going to tell you you've cited too much, or you're really not going to be marked down for citing too much. You want to make sure that you cite you're citing material that you have used in order to support your position. If you ever have any questions, you should ask your instructor. So me, Ms. Hain, as your instructor, I'm going to give you some explicit instructions about when you should cite. But if you're ever unclear with your instructor, just make sure that you ask. Is it okay to cite? Do you want me to cite every time I use this? So just make sure that you cite, or make sure that you cite the material. So what I'm telling you is that in this class, you don't necessarily need to cite every single sentence if all of the information came from the same source. And so particularly, that's in context, or that's talking specifically about summary or paraphrase. So if you're paraphrasing 3 sentences all coming from the same source, you don't have to cite every single sentence. You can cite at the end of that summary or paraphrase. But if at any point in time it goes to a different source, you absolutely need to cite that source. So what is Ms. Hain talking about? What does that look like? That's what this page is. So like I said, if there are multiple sentences in a row that come from the same source that you are paraphrasing, then you don't have to cite every single sentence. You simply cite at the end of that paraphrase. So I've got 3 sentences here. It starts with this paraphrase, then it goes to another paraphrase, then there's another paraphrase, and they all come from the same source, source 1. Then at the end of that paraphrase, that's when you can cite. Okay, parenthetically, that's when you cite. And notice how you are not citing sorry, don't know why it was such a weird color like that. You're not citing your commentary. When you are explaining material, my computer just hates me so much. So your commentary definitely is not need citing because that comes from you. So when you explain or when you provide commentary, that is not expected for you to be citing anything. So this rule is if you have multiple sentences in a row that are paraphrasing material, you do not have to cite every single sentence. You simply need to cite the last sentence of that paraphrase. So notice how right here is where it's cited because all the material after that last sentence of source 1 is not from source 1. So source 1 is cited here because everything after that sentence is not from source 1. So you don't have to you don't have to cite every sentence. You simply cite at the end of all of this summary or paraphrase, okay? So again, I'll get all of this garbage off the screen so that you can see it a little better. So that's what that looks like. Paraphrase, paraphrase, paraphrase. If it's all from the same source, then just cite that at the end of the paraphrasing. Now, if there is a quote that's in the middle of the paraphrase, then you absolutely want to make sure that you cite that quote. All quotes are cited. Okay, so even if it comes from the same source, all quotes are cited. I do not care if it's if it's a paraphrase from source 1 and then a quote from source 1 and then a paraphrase from source 1. It doesn't matter if it's from the same source. When you use a quote, you need to put a citation. When you use a quote, you need to put a citation. When you use a quote, you need to put a citation. So anytime you're using a quote, you need to make sure you put a citation. Okay? You need to cite the quote immediately. So you can't do that later. You can't, like when the quote is used, you need to cite at the end of that sentence if it's parenthetical, or you need to actually cite in the sentence itself that you're using the quote. Okay, if you're doing in text. So make sure that you include a citation when you are quoting. Now, if you're paraphrasing material and they come from multiple sources, you need to make sure that you denote when you are using different sources. So what that means is if I'm paraphrasing source 1 and then my next sentence is paraphrasing source 2, I need to cite when my paraphrase of source 1 ends. Okay? So again, what does all of this look like? It looks like this. So notice how I've got a paraphrase from source 1 and then another paraphrase from source 1. Because both of these sentences are from source 1, I am only citing here. Notice that there's not a quote, so I just cite here because it's paraphrase, paraphrase, and because they're two sentences that I've paraphrased from the same source, I cite at the end of this source. Or excuse me, I cite at the end of that second sentence. Then my second sentence, or excuse me, the next group of sentences that I'm using, I have a paraphrase from source 2. Now I need to make sure that I identify that that is from source 2 to signify that it's different from source 1, and then I also need to make sure that I cite that quote, okay? And so because I'm using a quote there, because I'm using a quote right here, I need to make sure that I cite that. Notice how there is no citation with the explanation here, okay? Because that's from you. The commentary is not, and that is not part of the source. The commentary comes directly from you. And so that's why you do not have to cite there, okay? So to multiple sentences that are paraphrased or summary, so they're not quotes that come from the same source, you have to wait. You don't have to cite every single sentence. Anytime that you use a quote, you absolutely need to cite. And here I put the source, I cited just to be safe because it's a shift from source 1 over to source 2. So I want to make sure I say where this is coming from. And because this is a quote, I cite that source. So hopefully that clarified any concerns that you have about when to cite. If you've got any other questions, do not hesitate to talk to me or check in, okay? Send a remind, send an email. Yeah.